For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one. St. Paul, in his second chapter in his letter to the Ephesians, talks about two different people groups who became one because they found their common identity in Christ. This continues what is becoming a three-part series on our identity in Christ. Last week, looking at the importance of anchoring our personal, individual identity in Christ, as St. Paul called all the Ephesians to do in the first chapter of his letter. But now he's talking about how there can be a greater identity, even between divergent people groups, to find that common identity that links others together. And so then we'll actually have, after this, we'll have another series just looking ahead on John 6 that will come up after next week, where we'll go deeper into what it means to be to understand the body and blood of Christ, that unity in him. But for now, we're laying a foundation of that primary identity that everyone seeks after. Now, when I was pledging a fraternity in college, you know the house you're pledging to. You know who you want to have as your college family, so to speak. But you don't know the other people who are going to be in your pledge class. I remember distinctly, after we first got a chance to gather with those who had been accepted, and I saw the 12 or so other young men who are going to be part of the fraternity, and I said, do I need to spend the rest of my 4 years with them? Now, no doubt, some of them were looking at me and thinking the same thing. But what happens, the genius, is that when you pledge a fraternity, the brothers haze you, which has a purpose, to put you through a difficult time, a common experience that every class encounters together. And as a result, through this shared adversity that you go through, you have a commonality. It's very galvanizing. And sure enough, 3 months later, we were like a family, ready to be friends for the rest of our lives. In Christ, we have that common experience to the thousandth power. And so it was Paul, writing to the Ephesians, talks about the fraternity that we have in Christ. The context is that he's speaking to two very different people groups. He's speaking to the Greeks, whose primary identity was their culture, and then to the Hebrews, whose primary identity was their ethnic identity, their theological identity in light of the law. No time in history have there ever been two such divergent people groups united together so thoroughly as occurred in Christ. But no doubt, when they saw one another, do I need to spend the rest of my life with them? To take this a step further, St. Paul says not only were they different culturally, but there was a dividing wall of hostility between them. That's the words that he uses. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. Now, part of our goal here in unpacking a passage like this is to bridge two worlds. The world of St. Paul's day and our world now. To apply some parallels, how can we apply this in our own life? And so I can ask you just to think for a moment. Is there a place in our day, or in your context, or a shared context, where you see a dividing wall of hostility? Some of you are smiling because you're thinking, yes, right in my marriage. Actually, I do use this. Some of you have seen this. I use this passage in all my premarital counseling, saying, beware of what's around the corner. Yes, I see some very serious faces here. You can laugh at yourself. This happens to all of us, right? We were reminded to find our commonality in Christ. We all need that. But I think something else probably came to your minds today that we share, which is simply our political landscape, our nation. You can hardly read an article that refers to our current political landscape without somebody saying, we're a divided people. Sure enough, Peggy Noonan said this again for the 100th time this week, as she looks at our political landscape in the Wall Street Journal every week. So here we are, in a divided people. Can this passage speak to our nation the way Paul was speaking to the church at that time? It's a reasonable question. But before we address this, let's just acknowledge something, though. We're trying to bridge two worlds, but we don't want to stretch that. We want to make a legitimate analogy between his world and ours. And Paul does not say anywhere how we unite all the peoples in Ephesus. He's speaking primarily to the church. So perhaps, one might say, well, we should just really just focus on the church, and be a subculture. We can't do much for the rest of the world. But we do have a different context right now, and I think we all sense this. We desire unity in our nation, I think in a way that's different than Paul related to his surrounding city-state or whatever it might have been, okay? Why is that? Well, just briefly, I wish I could take more time in this, but we are now post-Christendom. We have lived through centuries, right, after Augustine and into the Middle Ages. There was a Christian synthesis where this reality did speak to the whole culture. And that Christendom, which took form in the Middle Ages in a very romantic way that we look back to and sometimes long for that, we still remember that because this is what formed our Western culture. So don't we feel like we have some claim to this unity in Christ that on some level we saw politically in our past? We remember that past. We learn about it in history. It still speaks to us today. Which then brings us to our own nation, where I think we can fairly say was generally a Christian nation. Now, people take legitimate issue with that because was it ever defined as a Christian nation? Well, let's talk about this for a second, actually, before we can move on, because I think most of us, perhaps all of us here, do feel we feel some responsibility to our nation and grieve the divisions. I think everyone does. And all political stripes are so divided right now. So to what extent can this apply? Well, let's just park here briefly. What is our political context? It's not Christendom. It's not, we don't have a medieval synthesis where the Holy Father anoints kings who have a shared fidelity to the gospel on some level. But so once this idea of our Christian past in our own context, some would say it's not legitimate because we have a context of democracy where that allows all people to have legitimate claim as part of our democracy, which really follows through the whole political system, which we generally call liberalism, not liberalism in the sense of liberal versus conservative, but the post-monarchy way of governing in the West. And we can go back to Thomas Hobbes and Locke and others who define this, right? Where the idea of Hobbes was that, yes, everyone has their own idea of what's true, what's right. It's good. Everyone should be able to pursue that. But they'll be warring against one another, which is why we need a state, which he called the Leviathan, right? This necessary monster of the state to keep everybody and their divergent interests together. Well, that's unifying on some level, but is that what we're after? Do we need a more Leviathan of a state to keep us? Is that our answer to our problems here in this country? Well, this passage certainly doesn't speak that way, so this doesn't connect. But in our country, that whole idea was interpreted in a very different way. Fast forward to our founders who were influenced by Locke, Hobbes, and others, and how did they define this nation in light of the Declaration of Independence? Right? Some of you know exactly where I'm going with this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. A point of contact. So this is something to go on, isn't it? There's a sense that we receive these truths. There is something as an objective, a universal truth that they believed in that supersedes the desires of people warring against one another. Can we tap into that? Can we connect what Paul is saying by saying that this dividing wall of hostility was reconciled in Christ? Can we apply Christ to our nation now? What is our role as a church in light of our country? Well, I think it's fair to say this. First of all, the people, just stepping back for a second here, we know that most of our founders, some of you are thinking this already, were deists. They were not Christians. But their understanding of God was in a thoroughly Christian context. They were virtually all raised as Christians. They understood that most of the people they were governing were all Christians. And this formed their conception of God, deism, this a bit of an impersonal God, but that was still formed by the Bible. And so that is our context. It wasn't written into the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, but that was understood. That was almost assumed. I think it was assumed, okay? So I think we can say that. And so where do we go from here? In light of this, let's look back at our passage and try to see if we can speak to this culture with any degree of authority right now, if there's a hope for our culture going forward in light of our Christianity. You see, in this passage here, you had two groups, and what were they? I said already, the Greeks and the Hebrews. And before our lectionary passage, just a few verses ahead of time, St. Paul speaks to the Greeks, and he says, "Remember that you were at one time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world." Well, that's pretty strong, without hope. That seems like he's ragging on the Greeks right now. But then later on, this just gives a window to what he does elsewhere in a broader way in his letter. He addresses the Hebrews and says, "But in Christ we've abolished the law of commandments expressed in ordinances." So elsewhere we know Jesus didn't get rid of the law, but that is no longer our identity. There is a common identity here that was possible for them. It was possible in one part of history. It became the consensus for the whole Western world. Can that be the case again? Can others leave part of their identity to embrace this identity? In light of this, I heard an interesting interview with D.C. Schindler, who's a theologian just down in D.C. at the JP2 Institute. Written a lot of books just about this topic. And this very in-depth interview, he said something very interesting, where he says that Christianity allowed a synthesis between the Greek, Roman, and Hebrew cultures, not Christian, rather the Hebrew cultures, that enabled all of these cultures to speak to one another. So how did this happen? I think it's worth just reflecting on his thoughts for a moment, because it seems to speak directly to what Paul is dealing with in his passage, the same culture. And so, but they had all one thing in common. And what was that in common? Simply what we saw in the Declaration of Independence, that there are universal truths. And so the way he describes this is that there was human culture is meant to be, seeking after truth. Now, in the case of the Greeks and their philosophers, that was something that was rooted in nature. Among the Romans, there was a creative cultural institution. And among the Jews, the Hebrews, there was this theological truth that came through their ethnicity, through what was revealed by the God of Israel. And Christianity brought them all together in a way that allows them to actually illuminate one another. They just had to give up what was not of Christ, or at least put Christ in the center, simple as that. But all this context of the shared truth occurred before the apex of revelation of truth. What was that apex of revelation of truth? Simply the incarnation. And so Paul puts that at the heart of this passage. He gets it, just weaves it in very, very succinctly. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. In his flesh. Those words would have been unintelligible to anybody apart from this revelation. But this flesh is something that's carried forward by the church in time and space. That incarnation, once in time, continues through the church, which is why in verse 16, a couple of verses down, St. Paul says that he was able to make one body through the cross, one body of people through the cross. So they became one people by acknowledging this one truth. And so in one sense, there seems to be a lot of hope here because you have this trajectory, very similar to the framers as we had before the incarnation. This acknowledgement of universal truth. It's identical, isn't it? Except when that truth was revealed, the Greeks and the Hebrews and the Romans, they acknowledged that truth for what it was and became one. But then here come the framers, and this is after that truth was revealed, and what have they done? They've rejected it. So it seems to be parallel, but now we're on a downward slippery slope, farther and farther away from that revealed truth. So where do we go from here? All right, so someone's saying, all right, thanks, Father, you've shown this. There's no hope for our culture whatsoever. But let me just read another verse towards the end of this passage. It's actually not included in our lectionary, and it's key. And this is key for all of us right now, and this is where we need to anchor our lives. He says, so because of this reality, you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. That unifying reality that has never been encountered in a greater way in the world before Ephesus, before these New Testament times, never been greater after, is still possible in this world. Because just like with those soon-to-be fraternity brothers, we have a shared experience that galvanizes us. And this transcends every culture. And I can tell you, and I hope some of you have the same experience. For those who have their true identity anchored in Christ, this is who they are above everything else, you can tell they're a Christian. You can almost finish one another, you can literally finish one another's sentences even if you've never met before. I can't tell you how many times this has happened, and these have been some of the highlights of my life. Just meeting somebody like in an elevator, literal elevator, right? This happened before. You share a couple of words and you realize you have everything in common, your souls are in common, right? Or, meeting somebody in the workplace and they're in another department, you've got nothing in common with them, but wait a minute, you've got everything in common in Christ. You know that instantly, right? Because that shared experience, that's galvanizing, that's formed your entire lives. So, where can we go from here? Is there, well, let me just say this. Can you imagine that in First Things, Josh Hawley, all right, in our Congress, dared to say, our Christian nation. He wrote this, back in earlier this year. He actually made the proposal that we need to go back to having a Christian nation. How can he make such a claim as this? Well, what he said is that he was quoting Christopher Dawson, great intellectual of the 20th century, speaking primarily to the English people, but he made this observation. Every great culture in the history of mankind has depended on a common moral order and a common religious ideal. Every great culture has. And ours is not the exception. I mean, our founders didn't only believe there's universal truths, but, famously John Adams said, our Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. George Washington, de Tocqueville, all had these same observations. So we have an obligation to reclaim this, not to impose this, but to reclaim it. But you can't impose it, right? But you can propose it. You can propose it. And so this is where we can go forward. So what is our national identity? What makes us Americans anyway, right? Some will say, it's the Constitution, we have this in common. But the problem is that many others just, especially, learning recently, following from Woodrow Wilson, our 20th century president who rejected the Constitution outright. Many in our sphere today just think the Constitution is irrelevant. And what makes us Americans is, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sending that throughout the world. That's not an exaggeration. Or others will say, our American ideals is safety, making sure that everyone's safe and who they say they are. We can't offend anybody else. And that was a template over COVID. And the bishops embraced this. We just need to keep our people safe, But that's not Christianity. Christianity is not safe. The saints did not seek safety. And in fact, the cross is antithetical to safety. So not only did Christ unite us in the flesh, but he says in the cross that he making himself one new man in place of the two, making peace, reconciling us both in one body through what? Through the cross. If there is a truth, not a truth that we own, but that a truth that owns us, then it's worth dying for. Many of the founders were willing to die for that truth. But that content that they had, that Christian memory that was unarticulated, is something that we can still proclaim to the world. Interestingly enough, D.C. Schindler had this, brought up Sophocles, who was speaking to this, in one of his dialogues, pointed out to a sophist that I am trying to convince. The sophist was rejecting beauty and goodness, but the goal in the dialogue was to convince the sophist that you're disagreeing with your own self, that deep down this is what you desire. And that's what we propose. If there is a truth, then it is ultimately recognizable by everyone in humanity. That truth in Christ, the one who died for us, we are willing to give our lives for him. That meaning, that anchoring meaning, is what makes life worth living. And so ultimately, let us be refounded on this family of faith. Let that be our first priority. Rather than wringing our hands about the division we see throughout the world, let us be confident that we have a reality to proclaim. And it's only from that basis that we have hope, but that hope is eternal.